Late game in Rise of Nations is really bad. Sure, you might be one of the few people that actually enjoys late game, but I'm sure you would rather play this than this. Uh-oh. Oh, you lost your city with 20 million population even though you own the entire world? That's an instant collapse. Meanwhile, Monaco will just lose their entire country and be like, this but a scratch. That's just an example of why the late game is honestly quite terrible. In my opinion, there are 3 reasons for why the late game is terrible. Lack of randomness, lack of content, and unbalance. Rise of Nations is a game that is completely reliant on its players. Without any other players, the game is just basically a playground with no life. And this is one of the reasons for why early game is so much better than late game. That's because of the randomness. Sometimes random Germany players might just pull some 1939, or sometimes Fiji might start colonizing Spain from out of nowhere. Randomness keeps lobbies from becoming way too repetitive, and I doubt most people want to play repetitive games. And this is the reason why people have been asking for smarter AIs, because there can only be a few player spots but hundreds of possible AI countries. Smarter AIs would mean so many more endless and random possibilities for each game. Who wouldn't want to see a smart AI conquering half a continent and forming some cool formable? Compared to AI, you can't really control which countries players will play as, so most often than not, Africa and South America will be completely empty, while every nationalist player starts as some random European nation wanting to relive their nation's past glory, as they say. No, I'm not mentioning Turkey. Look at what happened to Bislo. So even early game suffers from this problem, but at least Europe and Asia is kinda active. However, it's in the mid game and late game where the randomness falls off hard. When you've finally conquered your continent, there will only be a few other players left, and most of these are the same superpowers. USA, China, India, Brazil, the usual. These countries are just way too formidable throughout the entire game, and there's no normal sane player that would dare to attack them as a small nation. I said sane. Therefore, they will be completely isolated while they get max research within 3 years and then snowballs at the speed of light. That's why having some stupid completely brain dead AI that can actually do something is necessary, because having an actual Mexico and Canada that attacks the US would stomp their progress a lot, instead of just USA forming the North American Union within half a year of the game starting, and then making $500 million. This would also fix the problem of late game joiners. There's now cool playable formables that you won't see often in early game. However, as we all know, this might be way too much for Hyper's already busy upload schedule of 1 update a month that tweaks a few modifiers. And that's enough for this month. This is why most of my suggestions for fixing these types of problems are to suggest things that's already in the game, and not suggest actual changes that require coding, because that's never going to happen, just like the espionage update, the GTA 6 of Rise of Nations. Global events that have a random chance of spawning at certain dates is one way to do it. For example, there could be an event that has a 50% chance of spawning on January 2023 that everyone could get. That increases manpower gain by 20%. Things like this could encourage certain actions, like invading more. There could even be random AI nations that have a chance to form a formable at certain dates, if none of their needed nations have been conquered. So like the Sokoto could have a 20% chance of forming in 2022, and the Empire of Brazil could have a 10% chance of forming in 2021. Things like that. I am just throwing out random ideas, but feel free to share your own, because randomness is a big problem that needs to be fixed in Rise of Nations. All of the current events that we have right now are just infinite money glitches. This is but one of the reasons why late game is so bad compared to early game though. Lack of content is another one. If we're doing a comparison, then late game is just completely non-existent in terms of content compared to early game. Like, there's zero, nothing, none. I'm not joking. There's actually zero content for late game. Everything is just behind a time wall that can be sped up, and there's no actual progression. You can get max research by 2022, and therefore nukes in a few years. This will tie into the Unbalance, but yeah, that's the gist of it. Late game has zero content. Take away everything you start with at the beginning, and there's nothing you can unlock later as you play the game. There's no events that happens at certain dates, there's no units, research, or anything that are locked behind certain years, like in HOE4, or any map game for that matter. This is the most straightforward problem and the easiest to fix. Just add something that are locked behind certain dates. You could argue that the research system is doing just that, but no. It just sucks. The snowballing is way too overwhelming. I understand that part of the charm of Rise of Nations is that any country has the ability to become as big as possible, pretty easily, but this is just way too fast. Shameless self-plug, but if you've seen this video, then you'll know just how insanely broken research is. You are basically forced to do this every game, if you don't want to die from other players later on, if they've used this specific strategy. And this ties into the Unbalance, which is the third reason why late game sucks. The research tree itself is fine, and the modifiers too. The problem is the speed you get them. This is a case of the rich gets richer. I don't understand the point of having a research branch that speeds up the speed of research by so much. Choosing to get faster research should be an exchange, because you give up the normal research boxes, and then slowly catch up. But in Rise of Nations, that's hardly a problem, because you can get more research in just a year of quantum computing compared to 5 years of no quantum computing. If you don't get quantum computing, you're basically crippling yourself. And when you eventually get quantum computing, you will be speedrunning the entire research tree within a few years. So you will barely experience any sort of progression. It's just, okay, I just got quantum computing and I have 0 infantry research. Okay, it's 6 months later and I now have max infantry research. Yeah, so this middle section you see here, between the starting and end, is just for show. This type of system also forces everyone to pick the increased research speed branch, unless you want to be way behind in terms of research. This is exactly why having certain research locked behind certain dates is so important, so someone just doesn't snowball this much. But personal opinion, just remove this research branch that speeds up how much research you gain. It would fix every problem of someone snowballing with research. This will make people actually prioritize and choose certain types of research, instead of just taking every literal one. Also, it would actually make people steal research into the late game, instead of having it maxed out by 2030 or 2035. And everyone would also be in the same level of research, instead of one country being stuck as a caveman, while the other country is planning on flying to Mars. Honestly, you could also just add an option to steal research from other nations, but for that, we will probably need spies, which will... yeah. And that's just the Unbalance in terms of research. There's also the Unbalance, or more like, the inability to actually play the game. War exhaustion scaling in the late game is just too punishing, and this is because war exhaustion scales depending on the population and unit amount, instead of the population and unit amount compared to your country. So for example, if I have 10 million population and 9 million of my population gets occupied, which is 90% of my total population, no big deal, like 1 war exhaustion. But if I have 1 billion population and 50 million of my population gets occupied, which is 5% of my total population, 5 war exhaustion, and now you're resembling the HRE. This is once again a very easy fix. Just scale the war exhaustion gain to your country's population. I don't understand why Hyperent isn't doing something that is so easy and would easily make late game actually playable, because as of right now, you simply cannot do ground warfare battles late game, because you will just collapse if you attack with too many units. Actually, you can barely attack at all, there's too much lag, and micromanaging is just simply impossible, because there's too many units. So every late game war just boggles down to massive naval battles that results in the enemy capital being sniped, and then simply moved away, and then it continues. For this problem to be fixed, Rise of Nations needs smarter troops. All we have right now to attack another nation without micromanaging is the auto-capture button, which can get kinda wild at times.
I'm in the abandoned city of Pripyat.
I'm inside one of the inch-and-down oil tanks.
I'm off to the Arctic for 3 weeks.
I think I've asked for this before, but make more auto-capturing buttons, like setting a certain group of troops to only auto-capture cities over 1 million population. This ability to reach the inability to play the game is also a problem, funnily enough. I'm talking about the speed at which things happen, which is another unbalanced problem of Rise of Nations. The speed at which you obtain new research or political power is so not scaled with the speed you conquer stuff. If you're average or above average at the game, most of Europe will be gone by like 2023 or 2027, depending on which country you chose. It's at this point when you start actually getting an ideology and research other stuff, and that seems like a big oversight. You should be able to do all of this stuff, like ideology and research, during your massive conquest against other players, not after you've conquered them, and all that awaits you next is a massive naval battle with the US. But why does this problem exist? Well, we have this thing called consumer goods. This small little quirky resource removes all strains of your economy, so it's rather a battle of who can sell more consumer goods early on, rather than who has the biggest population or biggest tax. This thing can give you like 10 times the tax income of Germany in the first half of 2019, which is absolutely outrageous. Country management is just non-existent thanks to this. Many people would dislike this, as we saw with electronics, but if Rise of Nations wants to become a strategy game, and not just a game about who can sell the thing the fastest, then it needs to remove the ability to sell consumer goods, just like electronics. Make it your country's economy versus another country's economy, not India's economy. Sure, consumer goods are fun to use, but it allows for massive blobbing early game that makes you too strong too fast, so that there is no one left to oppose you. It's not skill. It's literally just who has the fastest PC. Those are the main big unbalanced things in the late game, but there are so many other smaller ones, like being forced to play democracy during peacetime and then switching to fascism during war if you can, if you want to afford your massive navy. Also being forced to play specialization and maybe static lines under certain circumstances. There's no actual options to choose from. It's just pick democracy or you are going to get a taste of freedom from other nations. When everyone has the same buffs and same modifiers, then it's no longer a strategy game. It's just bigger number equals better gamer. In early game, there are so many options to choose from that all works. Static lines if you don't want to get in a massive depth with maneuver warfare, specialization if you plan on camping on random terrain, or even massed attack works, so you can get more manpower before you switch to another, better doctrine. Late game doesn't have these options. You have way more manpower than money, so massed attack just sucks, and maneuver warfare just doesn't hold a candle to specialization with anti-tank. There's also the fact that forts weren't actually nerfed. They were just put behind a small time window where you require 15 steel to build one. Almost the exact problem as research, where there will be no forts early game, but just a few years later, and every city will have forts in them. The problem wasn't fixed. It was just prolonged into the late game. Defense is still incredibly overpowered. A late game, that just means the game becomes a staring contest where you and your opponent measure your dick sizes by the number of nukes you have. And that's that. Subscribe if you liked the video, I would appreciate it. And also, join my Discord. I am planning on reviving it. But why should you subscribe? Well, you see, I listen to my subscribers. So when this gentleman asked me to stop swearing in my videos, that's what I did. There's no swear words in this entire video. So, go and fuck